Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to HLF in-person event. We hope to do this once a month. We had one last month, and this is this month, and next month also, hopefully we will have another event. Welcome once again. My name is Vijay Kumar. I'm one of the directors of the Hyderabad Literary Festival. Those of you who are not still unfamiliar with Hyderabad Literary Festival, it's an annual event and it happens over the last weekend of January every year. And for the last 2 years, we have had the venue of the festival has been Sattva Knowledge City. And 2026, let me take this opportunity to announce the dates 24, 25, 26 January 2026. And the venue will continue to be Sattva Knowledge City. Thank you very much for coming this evening to our sacred space. And just to make sure that it doesn't rain, I'm carrying my umbrella so that it doesn't rain. Similarly, just one more announcement before we begin. Very soon we will have copies of the book available here. And at the end of the session, if you grab a copy of the book, I'm sure Daneesh would be happy to sign for them. Thank you very much, Daneesh, for coming this evening. Welcome to HLF, and we are delighted to have this session in Secunderabad about Hyderabad. Because we thought that there's no point in having this session in Hyderabad. It would be like carrying coal to Newcastle. So it's much better that we have it in Secunderabad. So we deliberately chose a venue in Secunderabad. Let me begin on that note, Daneesh. Is there a sequel to this book coming called the Secunderabadis?
I mean, I'm glad you brought that up क्योंकि पुराने ज़माने में इसको लश्कर बोलते थे.
बिल्कुल.
And then Hyderabad was referred to as Patnam. But if I do have a good Secunderabadi family who has had an interesting trajectory from 47/48 to the present day, I would be more than happy to include them in a potential sequel.
Yeah, I think we can look forward to a sequel. I mean, because this is the season of sequels anyway. So maybe there is a book coming next. But Daneesh, let me, before coming directly to the book, let me try to contextualize the book. We have had books, let's say by Salil Tripathi, called the Gujaratis, and then Nirmala Lakshman's book, the Tamils. So, I mean, the subtitle of both the books was a portrait of a community, right? So when I saw this title, the Hyderabadis, I thought this would be a kind of a series, part of the series, but then I saw the publishers are completely different. So obviously this is not a part of that series. So, but I was intrigued by the title, Hyderabadis. So do you see the Hyderabadis as a community, like the Gujaratis or the Tamils, instead of calling them the Telugus or so do you see the Hyderabadis as a community with a characteristic identity?
I do, but I see them as a community made up of different communities that fall under this identity of Hyderabadi / even Dakkani, if you want to extend it beyond the borders of Hyderabad and Secunderabad or even Telangana for that matter. And Burgunla Narsingh Rao, I'm sure you've heard that name. One of his anthology of interviews, which his son Vijay and I think two of his other children put together, in that he mentions that linguistic extremism is anathema to the spirit of Hyderabad. So yeah, we might have our own little cliques, I'll even call them, Urdu, and even Urdu, trust me, that's a very fragmented community. From my reportage on the Urdu fraternity here, I know that. And even Telugu, these aren't monolithic identities. If Telugu was a monolithic identity, 2014 में एक नई रियासत नहीं बनती.
बिल्कुल.
For better or worse.
Yeah.
So I see Hyderabad as a very multifaceted entity. If that answers your question.
Yeah. So I think in that, okay, since you mentioned Hyderabad as an entity, How did you try to bring out that entity through these micro histories of, for those of you who haven't yet had the chance to look at the book consists of 10 chapters, each chapter devoted to a personality, and of course, using the personality as a peg and weaving the story around that personality. So it's basically a collection of 10 individual stories. And so, how did you try to bring out that entity that you called Hyderabad through these 10 portraits?
The thing is, this entity which I and both of us just spoke of, like I said, it's not monolithic, but at the same time, it was all about, finding a diverse group of people. And it wasn't just about the city, but it's also the history of the city, its different eras, through the eyes of its people. And that is how I tried to bring out by finding a diverse group of subjects. There is that saying, when you go to raise money for a business, you go to three people: friends, fools, and family. But I didn't have to. In this case, there weren't really any fools, quote unquote, to speak of. But it was just about getting these stories, the first-hand ones specifically, from people while they're still around. Okay, first-hand stories, जो लोग 48, 50s का दौर देखे, they're not going to be around for at least 5. We're lucky if they're around for 10. So it was just about a little due diligence and also just being in the right place at the right time, making the right connections. Okay, cities aren't just monuments, and they're not just only literature, but they're also the people. And chronicling them is how you bring about these notions that dispel already prevalent notions of what the city is.
Since you mentioned the diversity and these 10 personalities in a way representing that diversity, but what is the one story that you wanted to bring out through these 10? Obviously, these are not 10 unrelated lives, right? So what is it? What is that one aspect of Hyderabad that you wanted to bring out through these 10 stories?
So the aspect that I really wanted to bring out was this common thread. I hope I'm not giving the same answer by saying diversity, but there's just this common thread of what this Hyderabadi identity is, which goes back to the broader Dakkani identity, which spans so many different eras. And there were different, what connects Marxist Chupkaramaya to the Hyderabadi Pakistani Ali Adil Khan. Very diverse backgrounds, as we read. But at the end of the day, they all belong to this city which Kuli Qutub Shah wrote that couplet about. Mera shahr logan se mamul kar, rakya jo tu darya mein minya sami. So it's that it which I think which binds these very diverse different people. And if Ali Adil Khan was to meet, Chupkaramaya's son Srinivas lives in San Francisco, Ali Adil Khan lives in Toronto. Agar if they were to meet in New York, they would connect instantly because of this it.
Yeah, if you have to put your finger on that it, what would you say that defines? I know what you are saying, that it is very easy, just a word will immediately connect you to the person, right? So what would you say? Is it language? Is it tehzeeb? Is it, what exactly is that it which connects, let's say, somebody from Toronto to somebody who is in the US to somebody probably in Sultan Shahi, what would be that it?
Khatta.
Okay. And when you chose these 10 people, did you also consider but did not include? I'm sure, these are not the 10 that you've initially identified and finalized. So have there been any others whom you considered but did not actually include?
There was one other family, but this person who helped me out, he backed out for legitimate reasons, and I have to respect that. But if I'm to be honest with you, I just had to quickly choose these because, like I mentioned, some of these first-hand stories I needed to get very quickly. Who knows kya hota? And it was ultimately just about having access and, getting a hold of these people quickly. I at least try to be very punctual in, getting these stories, writing them. It was basically what was dictating this whole process. I wish I had more stories to choose from. There are other books like Achal Malhotra's In the Language of Remembering. This thing. I'm I'm jealous of just the sheer size of that book. It's a greatly written book. Met Achal once, great meeting, but the thing is, I just had to get a proposal written, summarizing 10 different chapters that I plan to write about, and then write the manuscript to get it in. So I really wish I had a greater pool to choose from, because Sanjay Amaro, I don't know if you read that review. He said, why didn't Danesh choose people like Parsis or even Kayas like Ellen Gupta? But just a small correction there as well. Ellen Gupta was a Marwari, not a Kayas, but that's besides the point. So, like you said, if there's a sequel and I find these people, why not? But ultimately, it was just about meeting deadlines as well.
Interestingly, this book has something very unusual. The notes are not included in the book, but there is a QR code, and if you are interested in reading the notes, you have to scan the QR code and read the notes. And this is obviously a kind of a commercial decision, so that the number of pages doesn't exceed, which automatically will jack up the price. So obviously this was not a decision taken by the author, but by the publisher. Since you mentioned deadlines, etc., keeping the page length, I think that's also very important. Yeah. You also mentioned, for example, let me begin with two parts of the book which I found very interesting actually. Not that I didn't find the rest interesting, but the first two, for example, the foreword by Raza Mir, another Hyderabadi, I found it fascinating because he speaks about a Hyderabad which I can connect. I mean, in a way that is my vintage. The Hyderabad of 70s and things like that. But in that, he says that, I mean, he finds it quite optimistic. He is very optimistic that the Hyderabadiyat, I mean, he doesn't use the word, but if we use Kashmiriyat, why not Hyderabadiyat? He says that the Hyderabadi-ness may be fading, but it hasn't disappeared. You also feel so optimistic, particularly at a time when the very face of Hyderabad, as we of my generation remember Hyderabad, I'm sure it is every generation finds it kind of lost, right? So you think with the influx of so many non-mulkis, right? Do you still are optimistic about the Hyderabadi-ness still remaining there?
I would say yes, because the heritage scene, it's grown a lot in the past 10, 20 years, 10, 15 years, I would say. You have, Yunus, the Hyderabadi boy, Lasagna, you have the youngsters behind Deccan Archives. So, like Razamir also wrote in the foreword, every time we feel that sense of Hyderabadiness is fading away, people like Danesh are going to come and rescue it. I don't think rescue it was the right word. Forgive me if I sounded very Messiah-like there, but he said something along those lines. Just the wrong word I'm recalling. And I think that young crop is there to keep that intact. But considering, I'm sure you've heard of the heritage. the Gadar Awards that happened recently. We know which movie recently got the Heritage Award, so that's a bit of a sign that there is a bit of that an onslaught against this Hyderabadiness is underway. But I think we'll manage. I think we'll manage and put up a good fight at the very least.
The other the pretext material that I found interesting was your prologue. The prologue.
Oh.
Your prologue to the book. Something that I thought was not adequately explored in the rest of the book was you give a sense that the Muslims of Hyderabad found themselves, in a way, again, this is not the exact word you use, but in a way, found themselves orphaned, after 1948 and finding their feet, elsewhere, etc. Do you think that kind of an identification of the entire Muslim population with the ruling regime, do you think that is something that is a bit difficult to maintain? Because in a way that, as people say, that even somebody who fixes, a puncture in your car tire or something, feels that he belongs to the erstwhile rulers. I mean, is that identification? Because that also gives rise to the kind of rhetoric that I have heard, for example, during elections. Certain parties rake up saying that, see where we were the rulers of, and see where we are now, we are rickshaw pullers, auto drivers, etc. This entire identification of a community with the ruling class, do you think that is something that is reasonable?
I mean, my family, we weren't a part of the ruling class. अभी वो दारुसलाम के सामने जो Krishna apartments जो है ना, that was where my dad's ancestral home was. So by ruling class, I don't just necessarily mean the feudal. I didn't necessarily mean the feudal or the royalty, but they were also just white collar people as well who just had a certain amount of benefit of being Muslim in a Muslim-ruled state. That's how it was. Even a lot of Hindus, despite virtue of being Hindu, despite not being a part of the power apparatus, they had it good. So, and you just mentioned puncture wala bhi apne aap ko samajhta tha. आज भी चाहे कोई भी वो ruling class का हो या नहीं, अपन हैदराबादियों में कुछ ज़्यादा ही there's a certain amount of how should I say this tumtaraf swagger which we carry ourselves with, and because everybody back in those times, or whether it's back in those times or those today, everybody wants to imitate the habits of the upper crust. It's seen as aspirational. So even the poor folks, they aspire to adopt those habits. Even today, everybody wants to go to the same fancy 5-star restaurants that the fancy people are going to. So that's the type of categorization when I meant jo pehle jo tha hamare paas. But in Abid Moise's book, it's a collection of his articles, Urdu articles, he said, Hyderabadi wo banda hai, and he doesn't demarcate any class, erstwhile nobility, present day new money, old money. He said, Hyderabadi jab Gulf ko jata na, sheikh ke gaaliyan sunenga, खामोशी से काम करेगा, नखरे नहीं करेगा. However, घर में एक अपना कपड़ा भी नहीं उठाएगा. So I think that we even find that today here too. But just to go back to your question, I think there was a hangover of just not being a part of the ruling class anymore. And it's not just the ruling class, government jobs. Umar Khalidi writes in Hyderabad after the fall, the government jobs which came easy to Muslims just by being of the same community of the ruling class came easy to them. Same thing in Jammu and Kashmir. अगर आप कश्मीरी पंडित थे या डोगरे थे या बाहर वाले पंजाबी थे, you had it easy. So that's another reality we have to come to terms with. Sorry for the long answer.
No, no. I think that's very pertinent because that also is one of the misconceptions that you address in the book, which is that the former the pre-1948 Hyderabad was kind of a heaven on earth with communal amity, that the Isa Musi, Tehzeeb and all that. But there was discrimination, there was disparity, right? And there was choices made, selections made, which discriminated against the majority community, right? So I think that's one of the misconceptions that you address in the book very well. But I was also thinking about what you just said about the Gulf migration, which anybody of my vintage will be very familiar with, because during our college days, we used to see people 2-3 years not doing anything, and you just ask them, what are you doing? The standard answer would be, bahar ja raha hu. For 2 or 3 years, it's like today, the equivalent today I find is what people say, competitive exams ke liye prepare ho raha hu. For 4-5 years, you see them do nothing, and their standard answer is, bahar ja raha hu, right? And I was just reading Banu Mushtaq's stories, where she talks about how people returning from the Gulf are treated like royalty, right? But the question that I want to ask is, there has always been a kind of a charge that the Gulf money, how has it fundamentally changed the thinking, the mindset of the Muslim? Because you see the migration, Gulf migration, as a kind of escape for the Hyderabadis after 1948, right? So how do you see that entire phenomena of the Gulf money coming to, and what has it done, right? Has it changed? Has it, because I have a counter question, but first let me hear you, what you think has actually been the effect of that Gulf exposure?
Excellent question. So I'll answer in 2 parts. Pehla, positive. The thing is, with the Gulf money, it enabled Hyderabadi Muslims who were still finding their feet, and it's not to say that all hope was lost between 40s to the 60s. The Communist Party, they were very helpful in letting Hyderabadi Muslims, or forget about Muslims, just any other people who, had faced a lot of upheaval due to the Telangana armed rebellion as well too. They let people know that, this is just as much your country as it is anybody else, who at least feeling to life. But then, jab 70s mein Gulf ke darwaze khule, people started making money. And that money came back here, did its part in funding educational institutions, helping Muslims have a say in the real estate landscape here. Because in North India, mein aaj jayenge na, things are totally different, to say the least, different topic. And it enables people to talk to the state. State se hum log baat kar sakte the, because they notice Muslims have purchasing power. They're integrating financially into the economy of this new and upcoming economy. And by the time liberalization came, purchasing power बढ़ गया था. And Muslims, they were able to, buy these goods that were coming in due to liberalization even before. And that's why a lot of, hum log education ki taraf gaye, and we're, playing a good role in certain fields, in IT, high-tech city mein jawa. You'll see certain amount of Muslims in working in MNCs, etc., etc. Even in the cultural space, you'll see them, doing a lot of good work on heritage. And the Gulf has also been a springboard for a lot of people to go to US and Canada as well. So double remittances, you could say. That's one. Negative jo hai, it kind of brought back a lot of the the very extravagant habits that the nobility had before. As I was saying, Purane Zamane mein we hope people used to imitate the habits of the nobility and the rich people. But as that money started coming back, weddings with too many dishes that go on into late into the night, and at the same time, success sometimes brings about a complacency, and that goes for any community who's seen up and down. So those are the two short answers.
Yeah, because a similar trend, if you see in Kerala, right? There is a kind of a popular perception that one can identify a house where somebody is in the Gulf by the huge gate, that they put up. One of the first things, it seems, in certain parts of Kerala, which has a large Gulf money coming in, and there were these kind of in those days cartoons, and probably today it would be memes. The flashy two-in-ones, right? The large, the kind of televisions that people used to bring. So one of the charges has been that the money actually has not gone into constructive, you mentioned education, etc., but there is also this perception that it has not actually gone into any constructive development of the Muslim community. It was limited to merely showiness, right? And very gaudy. And just one of the things that people talk about, I heard this from a very well-known author, that what the Gulf money has done is that it has replaced the more sophisticated Persian culture with the very, again, I'm using the exact word that he used, the very vulgar Arab money, right? The sophistication of the Persian, this thing, you can see that in the kind of restaurants that have changed, you understand what I'm saying, right?
Mandi.
The mandis replacing the Irani cafes, etc., and even the language, certain expressions which we never heard earlier, right? Now we hear them as, kind of an assertion of an extremely self-assertive community identity. So do you think there is that aspect of the Gulf money bringing in more, I would say, I don't want to use the word vulgar, but some kind of less sophisticated.
Ostentatious.
Yeah?
I mean, the thing with Arab culture is, 11वीं 12वीं सदी तक, Arabs used to produce a lot of knowledge. You could say Arabs were on par with Persians as well. But then, like I was saying, success.
Yeah.
And आराम जब ज़्यादा ही आता था, downfall शुरू, कोई भी civilization का हो आप ले लीजिए. That's what it is. But this Arab thing, the thing with the Arabs is that a lot of these 70s से लेके 90s तक जब लोग गए थे हैदराबाद में, that was also a time of churn in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And it's awesome that you brought up the Persian thing, क्योंकि that's when Iran और Saudi Arabia की, वो ज़रा conflict था वो दोनों का. So to assert their more Saudi or Arab identity, that's what Hyderabadis just happened to be among that milieu, and that was also the Soviet war as well. So there are good things that we've gotten from the present-day Arabs as well. The shawarma.
Yeah.
By the way, Indian shawarma doesn't count as shawarma. I'm sorry to say that. Mayonnaise, that's one thing. Usme hum log apna dal diye, but back to more serious matters. So, and the mandi jo hai, which you mentioned, वो पहले से भी थी, क्योंकि Hyderabad has a lot of Yemeni heritage as well too.
Barkas.
But one thing that I found interesting, but this is just more of my own bias against the Arab thobe, people are wearing the thobe even more. I'm just not the biggest fan of the really, just like I don't like the churidar, I like the patani. The only Arab thobes I like are the loose ones. So Arab wale, the Saudi ones are a bit tight. But at the same time, we read in the book as well, there's a certain, this is also a time where, religious majoritarianism, whether it's from the Gulf or certain internal dynamics of the country are on the rise. So that's, people like to, crudely call it petrodollars is bringing in this extremism. Yeah, I can't deny that. But yeah, that kind of, migration brings the good and the bad of Indian culture.
I mean, we cannot talk about Hyderabad without talking about the language. And what interests me is that you spoke about Urdu and you have devoted a chapter to Zohar and Sherwani and Hyderabad's contribution to Urdu. But I was wondering, what is your position vis-a-vis Urdu, vis-a-vis Dakhni? And because if you are talking about Urdu and contribution to Urdu, whereas some scholars, some people might even say that why are we talking about Urdu? I mean, Dakhni is not a variety of Urdu. Dakhni is not a dialect of Urdu. So Dakhni is Dakhni, right? So where do you stand in that, language debate about Urdu and Dakhni and Rekha, for example?
Another question where a two-faceted answer. For myself, जब मैं बात करता हूँ Urdu/Hindi, whatever you want to call it, Dakkani aa jata hai kaisa bhi. However, when it comes to reading and writing, I'm a purist. Khe bolunga main in speech, but likhte waqt qaaf. I mean, that's what I do in English as well. I mean, people say my English accent is a mix of thoda like East Coast, of thoda, a little bit of Ebonics, African American or pop culture language, but those outside influences, when you're writing like a piece for an outlet, you can't bring those in. So that's what I do with my Urdu writing and reading. But overall, when it comes to this debate of Urdu versus Dakkani, a lot of heritage folks, one of whom I mentioned, he on his Medium and his Instagram, he started this Urdu versus Dakkani thing, which I found fascinating to say the least. I'm not going to say where I stand on that, but I think, I like this diversity of Urdu, whether it's, Lucknow Urdu, Delhi Urdu, Hyderabadi Urdu, but Dakkani itself is not a monolith as well, too. Let me put that out there. I'll try to keep this anecdote a little, not lengthy. एक बार जब मैं Washington से आ रहा था, it was via Jeddah. So on the flight to Jeddah, there were a lot of, Hyderabadis जो उम्रे के वक्त आ रहे थे. And it was just so interesting to see people from Gulbarga, from Andhra, from Telangana, different Dakkani accents, and the city wale. And believe it or not, that divide between those different Dakkani, whether it's linguistic or socio-economic, was real.
Yeah.
As the plane take off हो रहा था ना, बेचारा एक बार बंदा, he just got up, unfastened his seatbelt, went to the windows, and was trying to see अरे क्या है, बेचारा, he's never been on a plane ना. फिर अपने सिटी हैदराबाद वाले वो बंदे को क्या बोलते मालूम, अरे मियाँ बैठ जाओ, तुम्हारा गांव नहीं दिखता और विंडो से बैठ जाओ, आंध्रा तुम्हारे डिस्ट्रिक्ट का गांव नहीं दिखता वहाँ पे. So language also brings up, it's a identifier of how even something as understudied as Dakkani is very non-monolithic as well.
Yeah, of course, there are these very strong differences between, let's say, Bangalore Dakhni and Hyderabad Dakhni. And but one of the things that interests me about, when you talk about Urdu, you talk about how there is a kind of a decline. And you attribute it to the rise of Telugu. But if you see historically in the Hyderabad, the state of Hyderabad, this Urduization, right, actually happened as a kind of replacing the more relaxed attitude towards language before the Urduization started. Of course, the Urduization started when the caste from North India started coming in, right? So as long as it was Persian, which was the courtly language, official language, Marathi, Kannada, Telugu, all were treated more or less equally. But when this Urduization started, although it is interesting that Urdu is supposed to be the language of the common people, when the Urduization started, many of these languages were marginalized, right? So this whole language issue, where Urdu becomes a kind of a dominant language, right? And that, I think, do you think that contributed to this kind of an animosity between the non-Urdu speaking, let's say, majority Hindus and the Urdu insisting Muslims in Hyderabad?
I wouldn't say it's just the Hindus as well. Even within Muslims of Hyderabad, this Urduization in North India का जो Urdu आया, and I'm glad that you asked this question क्योंकि when doing some features reportage for Mint Lounge, I asked Syed Mustafa Kamal, जो Shagufa Human Magazine के editor थे. He told me, and I found this on an academic article, कुतुब शाहियों के ज़माने में जो था ना उर्दू तेलुगु का जो सिंथेसिस था वो असल दक्कनी थी जो बोली जाती थी. Even what we speak today, the city Dakkani, I don't even, forget about me, scholars don't even consider that the real Dakkani. So फिर जब Aurangzeb, first Nizam came down, the Urduization, which you rightly pointed out, happened. Dakkani फिर घर की ज़बान बन गई. It was literally relegated to the household. It was people like Mohyuddin Khadri Zor who, in conversation and in writing, in conversation spoke Dakkani, but in writing, pure Urdu. They're the ones who bought Dakkani literature, manuscripts before. इसीलिए तो इदारा अदबिया के Urdu खुला था. So yeah, that has definitely contributed to that animosity, but at the same time, like Narsingh Rao Sahab said, जो उर्दू और तेलुगु का असल synthesis था, वो कुतुब शाहियों के ज़माने में आता था, and the further you get away from the city, the more asal Dakkani you'll get to hear. And lastly, I've seen this more among more of the more upper crust of society, especially overseas Hyderabadiya. Jitta mein zara, the more you talk like, the Telangana style Dakkani with a little more Telugu, लोग बोलते हैं ऐसा, and people told me, आप डिस्ट्रिक्ट वाले से कहीं जैसा कहीं को बात कर रहे हैं, क्या गांव से आए क्या आप ऐसा, and हिकारा की नज़र से ना देखते हो. So yeah, there is that, the Hindu majority Muslim rule the Hindu and the ruler Muslim aspect about it, but even internally, Dakkani and Urdu has quite the dynamic.
Yeah. You mentioned the districts. You talk about the Gulf migration from Hyderabad, etc. But what I found, this is not about your book, but very often I find that whenever people write about the history of Hyderabad, very often it is a very city perspective. As if it is only the Hyderabad city, the urban areas which were affected by 48, and all that. There is very little about how people in the districts, for example, you talk about the Gulf migration, very often it is, you obviously chose your domain, but let's say if you take something like Karimnagar or Sirsilla, right? There's a huge Gulf migration. And since you talk about what has so far been missing in the mainstream histories, I find that that's one story which has completely been marginalized. Because whenever we talk about Hyderabad post 1948, it is always the Hyderabad city's perspective that comes out rather than what happened in districts, what happened in the Mufassil areas, and forget about the villages, right? So do you think that there is that story which still needs to be told?
Absolutely, and like I said, if anybody has these stories and if they want to get in touch, I would be more than happy to explore the likely prospect of chronicling that. And I'm glad you asked me this as well, because at the end of the day, मैं city wala hu. I'm sure you must have sensed in the book, NRI city of a certain, bracket of society, that's going to shine. I'm sure you read Purtulen Haidar's Akadarya River of Fire in English. Most of her books, you will see, they take place around this very, very highly cultured, sophisticated, feudal society of Lucknow, who really imbibe the best aspects, even some of the worst aspects of that sophisticated, exquisite Awadhi culture. And that comes through in all her books. I'll even admit a certain amount of my privilege, you know, my upbringing, my perspective comes through, but I've just been very lucky and at the same time very proactive. So I've come across people like Umar Farooq Khadri, whose story goes back all the way to the districts of Marathwada. And that led me to the little, enclave that is Falaknuma. And then Chukkaramaya sab. Even his kid Srinivas, he's like, Danesh, we're not, big people within Hyderabad, ye sab. Hum log district se aaye. I'm like, so? I'm like, your story needs to be told. And yes, I'll admit there could be more, and it's a very glaring gap. But I've at least tried to do my part in addressing that by not keeping my chroniclings limited to the city folk. But like you said, it does come out, that I'm a city guy, NRI with a certain publish. But I've tried to keep that privilege in check as well. Hopefully, I've done a decent job of doing so.
I'll just ask the last question, and then we will open up for the audience. And the last question is largely a kind of, okay, let me put it straight. You spoke about the Telangana armed struggle, and you spoke about the Razakars. How do you see the connection between them? What is your understanding of, because you mentioned that Sardar Patel had a second objective, which is to suppress the communist movement. Many historians actually now argue that it was Nizam or dethroning Nizam was not actually the target. It was the suppressing of the communist, which was actually the primary target of the police action. Simply because if you see what happened after 1948, that the Nizam was retained as, Raj Pramukh. So dethroning the Nizam was not actually the primary target, but actually to suppress the communist movement was the primary objective. And then how do you see the connection between, do you see them as opposed to each other? Because there are different versions of the relations between the Razakars and the communists. So what is your understanding of that entire period?
This is where a good source of, what's his Inukonda Tirumali's book, Against Dora and the Nizam Struggle. So this is, and the Razakars, they were utilized by the Hindu gentry within the districts to suppress a lot of not just Hindus but certain Muslims as well, who were also crushed by the feudal, this feudal system in the districts. So that is why, and this is in Inukonda Tirumali's book, and it's also in Puchalapalli Sundaraya's book as well. I welcome everybody to go and read those two very monumental works. So, and you mentioned about, the Nizam. The objective was not to dethrone the Nizam. I think there's some truth in that too, but at the same time, I feel if the Nizam was a little, he's a foresighted person. We can't forget the good that he did, but this is where I think he faltered when it came to statesmanship. Some people say it was because he was under immense quote-unquote pressure from the Razakars. Some people blame, his advisors were sycophants. But the Nizam, I think he should have negotiated with the Indian government, as one of his prime ministers, the Nawab of Chattari, wanted him to do, and even Muhammad Haider, the author of October Coup, advised him to do. They were about to sign the accession instrument, but Razakars prevented a lot of these officials from going to Delhi and delivering it. So I think he should have, controlled the Razakars, or some people say he was hand in glove with them, and that he wasn't exactly that helpless person. But I think had he, negotiated with the Indian government, the best terms of accession, and then use the military help to quell the communist rebellion. And I say this not as because I have anything against the communists or the cause. No, no, no. I'm just saying it from a typical statesman perspective. Things would have been a little different.
And Nehru was more than willing to, give what the Nizam asked for.
60% representation for Hindus in this new government, in the legislature.
40% to Muslims. Yeah, and that's the kind of historical mistake that one of your speakers mentions that. So, ladies and gentlemen, and that's where we will stop. There are plenty of other questions which I haven't asked, but I'm sure you would do the needful now. So, we open it up to the audience, and please keep your questions brief so that Daneesh would be forced to give short answers so that we can take more questions. 2 books. Tirmalais.
Inukunda, so the question was, what were the 2 books I just mentioned? One is Telangana Rebellion and its People's Struggle, and Telangana People's Struggle and its Lessons by Puchalapalli Sundaraya. And the second one was Against Dora and the Nizam by Inukunda Tirumali. And I believe Inukunda Tirumali is still around. He's a good person to speak to about that.
He's around now. He's still around now.
Yeah, very much. Yeah, there's a. Could you please stand up? Could you please stand up so that we can see you? Yeah.
So the kind of people in Control, but obviously we have a very conscious effort to make them ordinary, normal people bodies. I noticed that you didn't chronicle anyone from the ruling, like the Jalabs and the Zam family. Is there a reason you didn't do that? I'm assuming it was a conscious.
Like I said, access. I don't have access to the royal family. Oh, thank you, whoever turned the light on. I don't have access to the royal family. It was just about, casting a wide net within the limited networks that I had and getting those families to speak. I would have loved to chronicle more people, ruling and non-ruling people alike, but yeah.
Adab everyone. Sir, Adab, is this book is like from the starting of Deccan era and from today? Is there any regular attendance of the people who living from the Deccan era and from today? This book is telling all the story about Deccan. Is it written that way of written? Your ratings will say the regular attendance of Deccan era to today people. It is in representation of your writings. This book is like that.
It's basically micro histories.
Yeah.
You explain your way of expression those.
Yeah.
So it's basically chronicling the lives of ordinary people. I mean, some of them, they did have feudal backgrounds, but I didn't want to take a statesman-centric perspective. Okay, when history is written through the eyes of people in power, sometimes, it offers a very high-level perspective, but I wanted to chronicle what people went through, not just in 48, but what happened in 48. Also, the happenings of 48, how it affected their lives, and how the past kept on resonating with them, even in subsequent eras of, 1956, when Andhra Pradesh was formed, 1969, during the Telangana struggle, and then the state formation and the new state and national dispensation we see today.
Yeah.
So, what does being true Hyderabadis mean to today? What is your opinion?
Oh Lord, interesting question. A true Hyderabadi is someone who, he might have that, mulki, non-mulki, which is natural to anybody, outsider versus non-outsider. But a true Hyderabadi is somebody who also accepts people who come from outside and doesn't, force they're a uniform, that too majoritarian outlook on them. That to me is a true Hyderabadi.
Thank you.
So what do you feel of now the Hyderabad is becoming like any other city of India with the changing times? The character of Hyderabad, which used to be there, now with the services industry taking over the cities, and all the cities when you go to Bangalore, Delhi, Pune, Bombay, all look same. So is Hyderabad losing its true character also in the process of evolution of development? Your thoughts on that?
Thanks, Sunil, for that question. Every era, whether it's, every era and the people who live in it, they see loss of their city. Even 50s, 60s, man, I think you can attest to this. People were like, "Arey, ab dosa idli aa gaya yahan pe." Mulki struggle ho raha tha yahan pe, people are saying, "Idli sambar, go back, go back." Ab now, idli sambar is very common. So people of that time felt Hyderabadians gayi because of idli sambar. But ab kya hai, idli sambar bhi ja raha hai. High-tech city mein, if you go to, Momogaro, all these fancy restaurants that have come up, that also is, some people see that as another nail in the coffin for the Hyderabadiness, but some people see it as, life going on. So I think in terms of architecture, in terms of, language, Urdu script, it's certainly those aspects of Hyderabadi are fading away. But like I answered Vijay Bhai when he referred to the Raza News forward, that every time we sense that Hyderabadiness is fading away, there will be people, even who are probably more proactive than me, who are going to come back and at least restore some aspect of it.
The book and my classes, they said the books on Hyderabad have been many, and yes, definitely, I think if we talk about the feudalistic feudal laws, be it Muslims or Hindus, and the people from the classes which were actually oppressed by them. So these histories are also the history of Darkhan. So as a Hyderabadi, are you going to stick to these Hyderabad stories, or you also going to, as a historian, always learn more? What can they expect from you? Are you working, based on your experiences, and people, I'm sure you're working with more people than mentioned in the books. I'm really looking for what is going to come from you.
Thank you for that question. As of now, with respect to book length projects, I'm taking a break from Hyderabad. Maybe if somebody else, if I do come across these stories, sure, at an early level conversation, I'd like to have those discussions, because also getting a book deal, it's not an easy thing. It's been quite the learning process. I mean, now that I know how the publishing industry works, it'll probably be easier, but as of now, with respect to book length projects, I'm going to, give it a break for Hyderabad.